Hello, this is Clinton Power from the Mind Body Training Institute, and it's my great pleasure to be speaking today with Wendy Behary. And today we're talking about narcissism in this free training. So welcome, Wendy. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's great to be with you, Clinton.
Great to be talking with you. And in this free training, we're going to be covering a number of different areas about narcissism. But to begin with, let us know a bit about your history. How did you come to be working in this fascinating field?
Well, I didn't choose it. Let's start there. Some people would say, is she a masochist? Who chooses to be an expert in narcissism? It really was something that I found myself becoming intrigued by way back when I was, in the earlier days of my career. And I would find myself with a certain type of client who would just push my buttons and kind of render me into call it a mode, a shifting in my emotional state where I was stirred up. I was rattled. I felt uneasy. And I was finding myself doing things that were not treatment effective, like giving in to demands and not setting limits and surrendering and avoiding and apologizing and losing my voice. And it was not characteristic of me or the healthy adult me that I thought I had evolved to at that point. So I was very curious about this type of client. And when I would bump into someone like this in a diagnostic setting, Dr. Jeffrey Young, the founder of schema therapy, and I was working alongside of him at the time, and we were working on models for borderline personality disorder and also began working on an approach for treating narcissism using schema therapy. So that was the beginning of it all.
One of the things I'm fascinated about is, knowing so many therapist colleagues over the years, you talk to them and you just mention the word narcissist and they run for the hills. Many therapists are actually terrified of working with narcissists. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because it's what it generates inside of us. It's that terribly uncomfortable resonant effect that can either be a reminder of something from our own personal life, personal experience that's uncomfortable and unsettling, or it's just that it can drive up feelings of incompetence or a sense of defectiveness that I don't know what to do. I can't do this, which is, for therapists, that's pretty disturbing and upsetting when we feel like we've lost our traction with someone, or we feel like we're constantly having to tolerate being disparaged or being abused in some way if you're working with, more overt or malignant narcissists. So yeah, it's head for the hills. And the typical battle cry is, why bother? They can't be helped anyway. You can't fix narcissism. So it's essentially a waste of time. Eventually, they're just going to cut and run.
So let's kind of start at the beginning. I mean, How do you define narcissism? This word it's thrown about so much in popular media, but let's really start with the true definition.
Well, the simplest definition, which really captures the idea of narcissism, is someone who is, and this is the word of emphasis, excessively self-absorbed. We all can be self-absorbed at times, right? We all can get into a little selfishness at times, but to be excessively self-absorbed much of the time, very focused on one's appearance or one's performance or how the audience is responding to us, or are they adoring us, or are we showing up like the superhero that we fantasize that we can be? This is narcissism, sort of in a nutshell, if you will. There's characteristics of that might include things like a lack of empathy, a lack of remorse, an over-controlling tendency, a show-off quality. They can be charming too. They can also have some interesting, lovely features from time to time. But you get this overarching sense that you're with someone who is going to dominate the scene, and sometimes in obnoxious ways, and sometimes in ways that can be terribly abrasive and abusive.
So if we start to drill down some of the key characteristics of narcissism, I think you've begun to touch on them.
Yeah.
Can you let's be more specific about what exactly are those character styles of people who we define as narcissists?
Well, think about someone who feels entitled to do as they want, when they want, whatever they want, to have what they want whenever they want it. There's a sense of entitlement. Now, they're not born with that. This is something that has been either constructed by way of an environment that was very special and overly spoiling, maybe, or indulgent of the child, perhaps a family of VIP status. That's one way someone can come by the narcissism in the sense of entitlement. But the other way, the way that we more commonly see in therapy, is what we would call a trait of narcissism that is, an overcompensation. So they act entitled. They will show up as being highly entitled to do as they please without consideration for the impact on others. And a lot of that really comes out of, trying to camouflage the insecurities that they feel underneath. So entitlement is a big one. Arrogance, they can be very prickly and arrogant, domineering and controlling, my way or the highway. Unempathic, again, they're not really paying attention to the impact of their behaviors on others or what the internal world of another might look like or be experienced like. They're non-remorseful for their actions. They have a very hard time with the art of an apology and taking responsibility or being accountable for their actions. So these are some of the more glaring features that you'll see in narcissism, highly, highly consumed by their performance and how they're showing up in the world in terms of, not just doing well. We all like to do well. But again, that whole excessive quality of doing well and being adored for it, receiving outstanding or extraordinary amounts of approval.
I'm curious, Wendy, have you seen a correlation between our current cultural climate, where there seems to be such a culture of entitlement and blame and people not taking responsibility? Is there any link between what's happening in the world around us and the incidence of narcissism showing up, say, even in your therapy room?
Yeah, I think it's hard to ignore it. You stated it so well, and it's really hard to ignore those factors. I think they certainly fortify the child who's growing up in an environment where they don't have a stable base, where good limits are being set, frustration tolerance is being taught. It's a hard job for parents, especially in this era, as you just point out, where everything is so accessible and quick and easy and fast, and your face is appearing on the pages of social media, and everything counts in terms of your identity and your worth in a more accelerated way. So I think it makes the parenting job a lot harder. But if the child is not getting, that steady diet of consequences for choices they're making, good, healthy discipline, limits when necessary, boundaries, caring about other people's feelings, some common courtesies, some good interpersonal skills training. If they're not learning how to be uncomfortable, which is part of preparation for life, and you're out there in a world that just makes it all so easy, I think we can't help but see that there might be some trend towards enhancing the possibility for narcissism as an outcome in personality.
How do you see that narcissism differs from other disorders?
Well, I think it differs in terms of that sense of entitlement, and we see in other personality disorders things like anger and avoidance and dependence in some cases. So some of this is overlapping, and it overlaps in narcissism as well. But the one striking difference might be that grand sense of entitlement and that super quality of being so cut off from their emotional world and the emotional world of others. In a functional way or in a dysfunctional way, they're just so cut off. So the wall around them is very thick. There's such a strong weighted emphasis on performance versus connection, which in other disorders, you're going to find people who are desperately trying to connect, sometimes in ways that are so much so that it can be disabling in a therapy relationship. But and they're just very needy, and they're very aware of their neediness. The narcissist is so out of touch with their own emotional needs. And so they're more likely to go quickly to frustration or anger or covert behaviors like passive-aggressive behaviors than to really show and experience vulnerability in the treatment room.
Look, I've noticed, Wendy, since narcissism, even just the the diagnosis has made it into popular media that people are so quick to diagnose people and to say, oh, he's a narcissist or he has narcissistic personality disorder. But when it comes down to it, is it hard to actually diagnose someone with this character style or even the personality disorder? And how do you go about diagnosing someone?
Yeah, this is an excellent question because it comes down to this idea of a spectrum, right? And in the model that I practice, which is schema therapy, and I think other models too might do this, but we look at narcissism as happening along a spectrum, so that there may be those who meet all the criteria that might be found in a diagnostic statistical manual, which we might think of as a more severe malignant form of narcissism, harder to treat, lots of traits, almost all the traits at levels of intensity that are very high. But, we look at the spectrum. I mean, there certainly are those milder, annoying, but not necessarily as difficult to treat, the show-offish types who can be sometimes annoying, but they don't necessarily end up in our treatment rooms. So we're paying a lot of attention to those traits, the level of intensity in the trait, and how many of them and how it's happening really along a range.
And I just want to clarify, Wendy, when you say malignant narcissism, what are you referring to there?
Think of it sometimes as the most untreatable form, the most difficult form to have hope. I mean, some therapists who might be listening to this would think, no, none of them are treatable. They can't be helped. Again, they're exasperating for sure. But I believe that there is a type that might be more untreatable, and certainly some that are treatable. And that's what I mean when I use the term malignant, is that just harder to treat because there's less of this thing that we call leverage. We just don't have any leverage to really bring them into the treatment room, to keep them in treatment, or the therapist is really just not able to ground themselves in a way that can form a connection with someone who is, not interested and not willing to buy in. So leverage plays a huge role in this. And when you have high intensity, multiple traits of narcissism and no leverage, you typically have no therapy.
Well, I'm very excited about this conversation we've begun, Wendy, because I think this is such important information that the public and therapists need to hear. We're going to be back soon in video 2, where we'll be actually talking about, can narcissists change? I think this is a really critical conversation. So I'm looking forward to returning shortly, and we'll be talking about that. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you.